Okay, let's go. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining the Departments of Environmental Protection and Transportation on WebEx and Facebook today for AMP 2021, How State Government is Supporting More Electric Vehicle Use in Pennsylvania. I'm Deb Klenotic, DEP Deputy Communications Director. We'll start off today with an overview by DEP Secretary Patrick McDonald and PennDOT Secretary Yasmin Gramian. They'll be followed by Colton Brown, DEP Energy Program Specialist, and Natasha Fackler, PennDOT Policy Director, who'll give more details on the basics and benefits of EVs and state government efforts to increase use of these zero-emission vehicles. We'll take your questions at the end. If you're watching on Facebook, just put your question in the comments. If you're watching on WebEx, please look in the bottom right corner for the chat icon and use the chat box to submit your question. Please be sure to use the drop down to choose all panelists and then write your question and hit enter. Our webinar is being recorded and the video will be available in a day or two at dep.pa.gov/amped and on the DEP Facebook page. And now, DEP Secretary Patrick McDonald.
Thank you very much, Deb. Pleasure to be with you all here this afternoon. We obviously at DEP have a keen interest in supporting electric vehicles for a number of reasons. The transition to electric vehicles delivers better air quality, and improved health. There's a lower cost of fuel and maintain the vehicles. There's reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and we have the potential for net job increases. Electric vehicles currently emit about 2/3 fewer life cycle emissions than a comparable gasoline vehicle. And as our electric grid continues to get cleaner, those emissions will continue to decrease. We've seen an increase in electric vehicle sales, and we expect that will continue to grow. And by supporting the adoption of electric vehicles, we can make sure we're getting those benefits sooner and make that transition as soon as possible and make sure we have the infrastructure to support it. Here in the Commonwealth, we've committed to increasing electric vehicles in a few ways. A couple examples. Under the Governor's Executive Order 2019-1, we committed to a 26% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2025 compared to 2005 levels. That order also set a goal of electrifying the state's own fleet by 2025, electrifying 25% of the fleet to lead by example. We also signed on to a memorandum of understanding related to medium and heavy duty vehicles, which sets a minimum goal of 30% zero-emission vehicle market share for new and medium and heavy-duty vehicles sold in 2030, and 100% market share by 2050. So in terms of supporting the growth of vehicles and infrastructure, one, we're helping to organize public education events like the one we're participating in now. We've produced the Pennsylvania EV Roadmap, and an update booklet in 2021 to identify strategies we can take to encourage electric vehicle adoption. Our Driving PA Forward program provides funding for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And during this webinar, you will learn about the benefits of electric vehicles, how to charge them, where to charge them, tips to decrease range anxiety, and available incentives, including our state rebate program for electric vehicle purchases. We hope that as you participate in this webinar, you're safe and healthy as we live through some unprecedented times. So encourage you all to enjoy the webinar, take good notes, and with that, I will turn it back over to Deb.
Thank you, Secretary McDonald. And now over to you, Secretary Gramian.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Secretary McDonald. I'm excited to welcome you to this webinar with Secretary McDonald as we highlight what our agencies are doing to promote the importance of driving electrical vehicles in Pennsylvania, and also to discuss how we are preparing for more Pennsylvanians to make the switch. Burning fossil fuels for transportation is the highest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States and the second highest in Pennsylvania. This gives discussions around the shift to electric vehicles as a real sense of urgency. President Biden's goal of 50% of new vehicles being electric vehicle by 2030 aligns with commitments from the automotive industry as more consumers are replacing their traditional gas-powered vehicles with electrical vehicles. I'm pleased to inform you that PennDOT has already begun its preparation for the EV future. In May 2021, PennDOT embarked on the statewide electric vehicle mobility plan, which builds on the information and strategies presented in DEP's 2019 vehicle roadmap and 2021 roadmap update. The plan will evaluate the current state of transportation electrification in Pennsylvania and will identify mobility challenges experienced by EV owners. Natasha Fackler, PennDOT Policy Director, will provide more detail on PennDOT's plan. In 2019, Pennsylvania was selected by the Federal Highway Administration to participate in 2 alternative fuel deployment plan projects to establish EV charging infrastructure along I-80 as well as I-78 and I-81 corridors. Additionally, at PennDOT, we've been focusing on how we can best prepare for electrification and share information with the public. Ironically, the increased adoption of electric vehicle creates a problem for us at PennDOT, as Pennsylvania is dependent on state and federal gas taxes for 78% of its highway and bridge funding. The dramatic shift towards electric vehicles is a great thing for our climate as well as safety as automation becomes more integrated. However, we rely so heavily on the gas tax, and we've been talking for years about this concern. So earlier this year, I was very happy to see Governor Wolf establish the Transportation Revenue Option Commission, or TROC. I was proud to serve as the chair of the commission, which was comprised of nearly 50 transportation, economic, and community stakeholders, including DEP Secretary McDonald. TROC was charged with developing comprehensive funding recommendations for Pennsylvania's large and aging infrastructure with the ultimate goal of eliminating the gas tax. In July, TROC presented Governor Wolf with its recommendations, which discuss how EV electrical vehicles impact our current funding structure and works towards replacing the gas tax with more sustainable solutions. We must support this new electric future and modernize our funding structure so our transportation network gets the support it needs to keep Pennsylvania moving. Please join me to hear more about how Pennsylvania is preparing for our EV future and how we are working together to provide a reliable transportation network to all Pennsylvanians. Now I'll turn things back over to Deb so we can get started with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Gramian. And now we'll hear from Colton Brown and Natasha Fackler on the basics and benefits of electric vehicles and charging, and more detailed info on state government support for these to increase use of EVs. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. As we're getting the slides up here, just a quick reminder that if you have not already, please open up your chat in the lower right of your WebEx and set your recipient to all panelists. We do encourage you to provide your questions and comments at any point throughout the webinar, especially as you're thinking of them, because we're going to cover a lot of content. We will then have a chance to go over some questions at the end. If you go to the next slide. So as we briefly touched on there, so some things that we're going to cover today is an introduction to electric vehicles, just cover some definitions, some basics, the benefits of those vehicles, the increasing sales that we're seeing of electric vehicles nationally and in Pennsylvania, some commitments that we're seeing both from the manufacturing industry as well as within Pennsylvania, the various programs that DEP and PennDOT have going on to support electric vehicle efforts, and then we'll conclude with those questions and answers. Next slide. All right, so again, covering those basics. So as we talk about electric vehicles, let's first define what we mean by that term. So we're all very familiar with the conventional gasoline or diesel powered vehicle. You know, it has an engine, it has a transmission, and it runs on nothing but gas. So we've also been becoming more familiar with hybrid vehicles over the last couple decades here. A hybrid vehicle essentially has a small battery and a small electric motor. And that provides a number of advantages. It allows brake regeneration, which means that anytime that you're slowing down, that vehicle is restoring power back into that battery. So when that battery builds up enough energy, it is then able to use that electric motor to deliver it to the drive wheels, and you don't have to be using the engine constantly. For the purposes of our conversations here today, we consider hybrid to still be a gasoline vehicle, not an electric vehicle, because the only fuel source that is going into the vehicle is gasoline. It does not connect to any external electricity source. Next slide. So then we have our two primary vehicle types that we consider electric and that we'll be discussing today. The first is plug-in hybrids, which means that there is a much larger battery pack than that standard hybrid, and that allows the vehicle to be plugged in so that it gets an electric only range before that would be depleted, and it would switch into gas mode and function just like a regular hybrid that we discussed on the previous slide. And then lastly, we have all electric vehicles, which means that the gasoline motor, the transmission, they are gone. It is a much larger battery. It has no tailpipe. And they're also known for having a very high torque. So anytime that we use the term electric vehicle today, these are the two vehicle types that we're referring to. Next slide. So charging is often where we have a lot of the questions when it comes to electric vehicles. We're just going to cover the basics of the different ways that you can charge an electric vehicle. It is a very different and foreign thing. You know, there's only one way that we really know of filling up our gas tank. There's a couple ways that we can charge up an electric vehicle. So the first is standard level 1 charging, which basically means that you're plugging into a regular wall outlet to charge up that electric vehicle. All electric vehicles are capable of charging this way, and in fact, they all come with a level 1 charging cord that plugs into the charging port of the vehicle, plugs into a regular wall outlet, and you can charge up that way. You'll generally get about 4 miles of vehicle range per hour charging this way. That sounds pretty slow, but also think about how much time most vehicles spend parked. In fact, many plug-in hybrid vehicle owners, as well as electric vehicle owners that typically drive less than 50 miles a day, find that this completely suits all of their charging needs and never choose to install anything faster at home, even if they can charge at home. Next, we have level 2 charging, which is probably the most common form of charging for electric vehicles, whether it's at home or work or in public. This is generally done with what we would typically think of as like a dryer outlet. It's at your 220, 208 to 240 voltage, usually 30 to 40 amps, something in that range. You'll get about 7.2 kilowatt hours of charging per hour that you're charging, and that's about 20 to 25 miles of vehicle range. So this is a fast enough charge that even if you have a 300-mile range and you park it empty, it will get a full charge overnight. So that's what many people will choose to do for a fully electric vehicle for home or work or otherwise. Lastly, we have DC fast charging. Obviously, the fastest form of charging and most commonly occurs in community areas where there's a high level of electric vehicle adoption or along interstates when you're traveling long distances. DC fast charging is very commonly these days being designed so that you can get close to a full charge in 20 to 30 minutes. Basically, the concept here is that if you're on a long road trip, you need to stop for a meal or a bathroom break every 3 to 4 hours. And while you're stopping for that meal for 20, 30 minutes, your vehicle will be fully charged and ready to go. So that way it can meet the travel needs of everyone. DC fast charging is generally going to be your charging method that you would go to last. You generally are going to want to go to level 1 or level 2 charging since it is more affordable. But we are building out that DC fast network so that it is that backup for that longer travel or just when you need a quick top off. Next slide. And then another common question about charging is the plug types, which can seem a little bit complicated, but for the most part, it's becoming more standardized and easier to use. So we mentioned there's that level 1 and level 2 charging. And all of these charging plugs use the standard J1772 plug type, where it goes into the vehicle. The only exception there is that Tesla vehicles have their own plug type, but Tesla vehicles also always come with the J1772 adapter, so they are able to use any charging plug out there. The only time that you would not be able to charge from like a public level 2 station or something like that is if you have a non-Tesla vehicle and it's a Tesla plug. Only Teslas can use that plug type, but the vast majority of level 1, level 2 charging is going to use that J1772. Next slide. DC fast charging is a little bit trickier, but it is becoming more standardized. So every vehicle other than the Nissan Leaf and Tesla vehicles use the CCS, which stands for Combined Charging Standard. Nissan Leafs use the CHAdeMO plug type, and Teslas can use the Tesla plug type, or they can use CHAdeMO with an adapter. So increasingly, more of the stations that we're seeing installed are going with that CCS plug type because that is becoming the standard, with of course the exception of Tesla, which has some of its own charging stations. Next slide.
Thanks, Colton. One of the
Yep,
questions
and here
we
we'll
hear,
switch over to Natasha. Thank you.
one of the questions we often hear is where do you charge your car if you are out and about? And there's many available resources to help drivers find public charging stations. In addition to popular websites and apps, most electric vehicles also have navigation options to help you find charging stations and even to help you plan for long distance trips. All of these resources update regularly, and as more and more charging stations are installed, more stations are available. Next slide. One advantage to electric vehicle owners is that they cost much less to fuel and maintain than gasoline vehicles. An electric vehicle will typically cost 50 to 70% less in fuel and maintenance than a gasoline vehicle. When charging an electric vehicle at home, you typically spend on electricity the equivalent of $1 per gallon for gasoline. Electric vehicles also have fewer moving parts than gasoline vehicles and often don't need much oil changes, and often don't even need an oil change. So their routine and ongoing maintenance costs are usually much lower. Next slide. Electric vehicles cause much fewer life cycle emissions than gasoline vehicles, even after accounting for the emissions during production of the vehicle. An electric vehicle emits about 2/3 fewer air pollutants than comparable to gasoline vehicles. As our electric grid gets cleaner, electric vehicle emissions will continue to decrease. Air pollution decreases our quality of life and increases rates of health conditions such as asthma, especially among vulnerable populations such as children, elderly, and individuals that work outside. Poor air quality often disproportionately impacts minority and low-income communities as well. Electric vehicles will help to improve local air quality and improve quality of life for individuals in all communities. Next slide. In addition to health and climate benefits, a recent study by Advanced Energy Economy found that Pennsylvania is poised to experience net job gains for increased vehicle electrification due to our existing and adaptable supply chain and industries. Next slide. Electric vehicle sales continue to increase over time. While overall vehicle sales were down in 2020, electric vehicle sales increased by 15%, which caused a 40% increase in electric vehicle market shares last year. 2021 is now on track to show a dramatic increase in sales. In Pennsylvania, the number of electric vehicles sold from January to June of this year was just under 7,000. And in addition to many of electric vehicles that are registered in Pennsylvania are purchased from our neighboring states. The most recent analysis of Pennsylvania's registered vehicles in February of this year determined that there were 16,915 all-electric vehicles and 11,545 plug-in hybrid registered vehicles in Pennsylvania. This is a total of 28,460 plug-in vehicles. This number is likely several thousand higher today based on the number of recent sales since the February calculation. Next slide. The number of publicly available charging stations in Pennsylvania continues to grow as well. In the last 12 months, an additional 600 public charging plugs became available. There are now over 2,400 charging plugs available at more than 1,000 locations. Some of these plugs are only usable by Tesla drivers, but about 80% of them are usable by any electric vehicle. Nationwide, as of April 2021, there is also approximately 38,000 publicly accessible non-Tesla EV charging stations. Next slide. As was mentioned earlier in the presentation, auto manufacturers are in overdrive to push electric vehicles to market and plan on spending around $225 billion in developing new electric and plug-in vehicle models. For instance, Ford announced they will have 40 electric models available by 2022, including popular variations of the F-150 and Mustang models. Volvo has doubled down its pledge to generate 50% of its global sales of EVs by 2025 and said in a release recently that every year over the next 5 years, they will create a new electric vehicle model. This trend is also not specific to passenger vehicles. The trucking industry is exploring electric technologies for their medium and heavy-duty fleets as well. Next slide. As Secretary McDonald mentioned, Governor Wolf in 2019 signed an executive order to address climate change and promote energy conservation and sustainable governance. This set statewide goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 26% in 2025 and 80% by 2050. It also puts the Commonwealth on a path to reduce 25% of our state passenger fleet vehicles with electric vehicles by 2025. Each of the Commonwealth agencies are actively working to procure their fleet vehicles and the charging infrastructure to support them. Next slide. Similar to our state goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, 15 states and Washington, D.C. have signed on to an MOU in summer of 2020 to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from medium and heavy-duty vehicles by 2030 and by 2050. Next slide. Currently, in Pennsylvania, there's an alternative fuel tax for all alternative fuel vehicles paid by users that goes towards the motor license fund for use of the roadway. So as Secretary Gremian mentioned, the trends that we've discussed earlier in the presentation related to electric vehicle adoption, while positive in themselves, continue to reduce gasoline and diesel consumption. And all this is excellent step for making transportation cleaner and greener. It also means a further reduction in revenue from the liquid fuels tax and contributes to the growth of the current $9.3 billion transportation funding gap. We here in Pennsylvania are currently continuing to discuss with our General Assembly equitable and efficient ways to ensure that EV drivers pay for their use of the roadway system. Next slide. Designating alternative fuel corridors is a way to identify alternative fueling station availability, such as electric vehicle charging, hydrogen, propane, and national gas fueling. Starting in 2016, Pennsylvania had interstates designated in all 5 rounds of the Federal Highway Administration's Alternative Fuel Corridor Program. The map you see on the screen shows just the Pennsylvania electric vehicle corridors. A corridor is marked pending when public DC fast charging stations are separated by more than 50 miles, and a corridor is marked as ready when the public DC fast charging stations are within 50 miles of each other. The locations must be within 5 miles of the highway. Next slide. In preparation for potential new funding from the federal government for electrification and in pursuit of our mobility plan, PennDOT created an internal cross-departmental team to answer questions, identify priorities, and complete action items related to 3 focus areas: education and outreach, public EV deployments, and EV fleets. In addition, the department is meeting regularly and collaborates regularly with our state agencies and our stakeholders to ensure efficiency of Pennsylvania's EV rollout. As was mentioned earlier, Pennsylvania was selected by the federal government to participate in 2 of 5 alternative fuel deployment plan projects to establish EV charging infrastructure along corridors I-78 and 81 and on Interstate 80. These projects looked at corridors comprehensively to determine gaps in the spacing of various fuel alternative technologies, including EV charging. Considering that EVs can take up to 30 minutes or more to charge, an evaluation also considers amenities such as dining and retail and convenient shopping that would be of interest of travelers. In June of 2021, Pennsylvania completed the first of those deployment plans with the installation of both electric vehicle charging and compressed natural gas filling stations along the I-78-81 corridor from Pennsylvania-Maryland border to the Pennsylvania-New Jersey border. This study identified gaps along the corridor and prioritized locations to ensure that the gaps would be filled. In addition, funding opportunities and outreach materials have been developed to leverage external stakeholders and private partners in developing the charging infrastructure along these corridors. The I-80 deployment grant was awarded to multiple states, with Illinois DOT as the lead agency. This project is in process right now and will develop alternative fuel corridor deployment plans for EV charging along infrastructure from I-80 from the New Jersey border to the Iowa-Nebraska border. And speaking of other ways that we are working to make sure mobility is there for our traveling public, in May of 2021, the department embarked on the statewide electric vehicle mobility plan, which builds on the information and strategies presented by the Department of Environmental Protection and their 2019 vehicle roadmap and their 2021 roadmap update. Pennsylvania is evaluating the current state of electrification, identifying mobility challenges, and developing ways to expand our EV charging network in an equitable, sustainable, and efficient manner. The plan will identify key opportunities for expansion for EV charging infrastructure, specifically related to commuter, destination, and emergency travel needs. The plan is anticipated to be completed this winter. Next slide.
Great, thank you. So now we're going to discuss some of the ways that the DEP is also helping to increase electric vehicle adoption. So first off, we have a rebate for consumers, for individuals. I'll cover that in a little bit more detail in a moment. We have a variety of incentives, financial incentives for businesses, nonprofits, and local governments. There's a grant program for alternative fuel fleet vehicle transitions. We'll cover that as well. We help coordinate the Drive Electric Pennsylvania Coalition with PennDOT. We also provide funding for electric vehicle charging along interstate corridors. My office at DEP is soon going to be embarking on a rate design study for electricity rates for electric vehicle charging. That will help ensure that we both increase the adoption of electric vehicles, but also maximize their benefits and ensure that our grid is ready for the charging. And lastly, we do a lot of stakeholder and public education, such as events like this. One quick reminder there for anyone that hopped on since the last reminder. If you're on the WebEx platform, please open the chat icon in the lower right of your screen. We're already getting a few comments and questions, so please feel free to continue sharing, and we'll have some time at the end to answer them. Next slide. So as has been mentioned, in 2019, DEP released the electric vehicle roadmap, which identified 13 recommended actions for increasing electric vehicle use in Pennsylvania. And it was then updated in 2021 in a booklet format. So this link here will take you to information about that, including a link to that roadmap update. It's a really good 12-page booklet that has an introduction to electric vehicles, as well as the programs that we offer, and some ways that we can continue building upon the growth of electric vehicle sales. So if you're interested, or if you want to share any of that sort of information, this is a great resource for you. Next slide. So here's that rebate for individuals that we mentioned earlier. So DEP offers a rebate of $750 for new or used electric vehicle purchases, and $500 for new or used plug-in hybrids, as well as electric motorcycle purchases. There's an additional $1,000 that would get added to any of those for applicants that qualify for a low household income threshold. So for more information about that program, feel free to check out that link there. You just have to submit an application for your rebate within 6 months after the vehicle purchase. Those used vehicle sales, it does have to be one-time pre-owned with no more than 75,000 miles at the time of purchase. Next slide. So we also offer a variety of incentives for nonprofits, local governments, and businesses. For example, through our Driving Pennsylvania Forward programs, including the level 2 rebate, we have helped fund over 1,200 charging plugs throughout the state, certainly contributing to that growth that you saw in some of the previous slides. We're also helping to fund the installation of DC fast charging, particularly in high usage areas and along our interstate highways to enable that long distance travel. So there's like I said, there's a variety of funding source programs through Driving PA Forward. So certainly check that out if you're interested. And then the other program that we have is the Alternative Fuel Incentive Grant Program. That's the one that helps fleets transition to alternative fuels such as electric vehicles. Next slide. In addition to these incentives that we just covered, you can pair them with the federal incentives that are available at this time. So there is the federal income tax credit of up to $7,500 for the purchase of a plug-in hybrid or electric vehicle. This is no longer available for GM or Tesla purchases, although the federal government is currently considering expanding this tax credit, as well as seeing if it can be a point of sale incentive. So certainly keep an eye out for any changes on that. There is also a lesser known federal incentive that is up to 30% or $1,000, whichever is less, to install charging equipment at your home. So this can help with that cost of installing a level 2 charging plug at home if you so choose. This program is generally renewed in 1-year increments. So at the moment, it will expire at the end of this calendar year, but it has been extended in 1-year increments for several years now. If you are a business, that tax credit is capped at $30,000. So it is a good way to help get some charging in place for either your fleet vehicles you want to transition, or for your employees so they have a place to charge at work. Next slide. So we're just going to cover 2 of some of the top things that can really hold someone back or cause some hesitancy regarding an electric vehicle purchase. One is obviously affordability. We know that electric vehicles at this time currently have a higher upfront cost. This should change over time as the cost of making those electric vehicle batteries decreases. But for now, you're oftentimes, for a brand new vehicle with a long range of 250 miles or more, you could be looking at a higher cost of $10,000 or more compared to its counterpart gasoline vehicle. Plug-in hybrids generally looking closer to $5,000 to $7,000 for a higher upfront cost. While you have that higher upfront cost, you also save a lot on the fuel and maintenance. So it's important that if you're looking at a car payment and what you can afford, think about what you'll be reducing in your gasoline purchases per month. So for example here, this is just a pretty typical calculation. If you're looking at a car that would get 30 miles a gallon and you're looking at an electric vehicle, this is your fuel savings right here, about $75 per month, which can go a long way towards affording that higher upfront. Additionally, this is even before you would consider any local, state, or federal incentives for that purchase, so that can help drive down that cost differential. When you're shopping for an electric vehicle, especially on the used market where there can be some good opportunities at times, those savings can be even more compelling. Gasoline vehicle maintenance, as we know, will generally start trending upward, especially as you make your way past 100,000 miles. But for electric vehicles, maintenance doesn't change too much over time unless something would have caused a larger issue. The main thing to look out for on older electric vehicles is the battery range, to just check if it's had any degradation or if it's a model that could be prone to that. But overall, there are some good deals to be had, especially once you factor in those incentives. There are a variety of online calculators that will help you calculate these fuel and maintenance savings, so you can see if it would be affordable for you. And as I mentioned, as electric vehicle production continues to scale up, this cost differential will continue to decrease for the all-electric vehicles. The plug-in hybrid differential may stay the same. Next slide. And then the most common concern of potential electric vehicle owners is range. People are often worried, that this vehicle only goes 250 miles. I'm used to a gasoline tank that can get me 400 or 500 miles, and I can fill it up anywhere. And the trick here is that owning an electric vehicle is generally the cure for these concerns. You find that as long as you can charge at home, you start every day with a full battery of 200, 250 plus miles of range, and most of us rarely drive that many miles in a day. So that means that most of the time, electric vehicle batteries never even come close to running out. And those few days that you may be traveling hundreds of miles, you very likely traveled close enough to a charging station that as long as you keep an eye out for it, you'll be able to do a pit stop and charge up and be good to go. So yeah. And next slide. So to sum up here, what we're really seeing with electric vehicles is the sales are increasing over time. We're getting more and more models on the market. Dozens have already been announced just in the upcoming couple of years. We're getting more charging stations in place. And most sales forecasts at this point anticipate at least 25 to 40% electric vehicle market share by 2030. And that is without any increased government support. So if there is a increased federal program or new federal programs, then those forecasts will likely increase accordingly. So PennDOT and DEP are both working to facilitate this rapid change, as well as prepare Pennsylvanians and our infrastructure for electric vehicles. And thank you. I'll turn it over to Deb to help lead us in any questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. And we do have some good questions. The first one is kind of a twofer about charging stations. And the question is, how much do charging stations cost to purchase and install? And who will be purchasing the stations?
Sure. So like a number of things, the basic answer would be it really depends. So a charging station will vary in cost pretty significantly, especially depending on the type of charging you're looking at. So if it's level 2 charging, then the cost for a public station is probably going to be somewhere around $5,000 to $10,000 per plug. So that's not too bad. If we're looking at DC fast charging, things that are likely at rest stops and things like that, then we're looking at closer to 100,000 or more per plug. For now, there's government incentive programs to help with this purchase cost. There are still private companies out there that are installing these stations without government support. And over time, that upfront investment will continue to make more and more sense for those private businesses. And that transition will occur over time, that it will become entirely private investment.
Okay, next question, another twofer. How much is the electricity to charge a vehicle? And where is that revenue going?
Sure. So the electricity itself in Pennsylvania is usually, 11, 12 cents per kilowatt hour. If you're at a public station, they're obviously going to charge a little bit more than that because they also want to recoup some of the costs that they put into the equipment and to maintaining that station. So if it's level 2 charging, maybe that's more like 20 cents per kilowatt hour that they would charge. If it's DC fast charging, maybe they're charging you 30 cents per kilowatt hour. That revenue is going to whoever is running the station. So that might be the property owner. It might be a charging equipment company who's running that station and essentially leasing the parking space from the property owner. There's a variety of business models, but whatever you're paying is going to whoever's running the station, just like if you were to fuel at a gas pump.
Okay, next question. What will the role of electric vehicles be in rural Pennsylvania, where locations are spread out farther apart compared to urban areas and don't have an EV corridor for charging stations?
Thanks, Deb. I can address some of that. From our agency's perspective, one of the things that we've been hearing as we've been talking to electric charging companies is there really is an interest to make sure that there's charging equitably across the state, not just across the state, but across the country for all communities. And I know that the mobility plan that we are working on here at PennDOT is really looking at some of those things, making sure that there is mobility options for all commuters, not just those with shorter commute distances, but those with longer commuting distances as well. It's looking at key destinations across the state. We have destinations in Pennsylvania, many of our rural areas that are popular tourist destinations that many people like to get to. So making sure not only while they're at those venues, but as they're traveling to and from those venues, that there is availability. And really also looking at, from the emergency perspective, winter storms, natural disasters, any kind of emergency evacuation that might happen in the state, making sure that vehicles would have a way to travel during those situations as well.
Okay, next question. Are state government agencies considering installing electric charging locations at their facilities for employee use?
Yeah, so this one is actually a little bit complicated for us. It is something that we would really like the ability to do, but state legislation prevents the Commonwealth from directly vending. So we would not be able to charge for the use of those stations. And if the Commonwealth provided free charging for employees, then it would be an employee benefit, and that would get complicated as well. So in the future, it's possible the Commonwealth could look to a third-party vendor to kind of manage that process to enable it. For now, we're really focused on electrifying state vehicles. And once we have made more progress on that, then we may turn attention to employee charging as well.
Okay, next question. Can you address the trucking industry's concerns about the higher cost and higher weight of electric trucks?
Sure. So there, as we look at larger and larger vehicles, electric vehicles can get a little bit more complicated. That battery does get heavier. It's hard to have a long enough range. That battery weight could be taking away from cargo weight that they would like to be transporting. It's important to keep in mind as we look at medium and heavy duty vehicles that 85% or more of them are generally regional, used regionally or short haul. So those vehicles can be replaced with electric vehicles that have ranges in the realm of 150 to 200 miles, which is not such a large battery that it's going to significantly impede their operations in any way. So long distance trucking, where you're going 500 miles before you're filling up and you need to be transporting 80,000 or tens of thousands of pounds of cargo, we certainly don't have all of the answers yet. But there's many places that we can make progress now. And so that's what we're focusing on. And there's continued research and development on what will really be the best low emission solution for those types of transportation.
Okay, next question. Your savings don't include how the state is going to cover the loss of gas tax. What are the true estimated savings?
So that is a good question. I think during the presentation we talked about while electric vehicles do benefit the climate and many other things, as the Department of Transportation, who depends on the gas tax revenue to fund our transportation infrastructure, that is an impact for us as an agency and overall as the Commonwealth. We have been working with the legislature to look at different ways to make sure that electric vehicle owners are paying for use and access to the system. The T-ROC commission that the Secretary Gramian mentioned did have two different proposals for charging electric vehicles that came up as recommendations from that. But again, those are things that we're working with the legislature on to make sure that Pennsylvania does have funding to support all of our transportation needs.
Thank you. Next question is about the AFIG program. Could you talk a little bit about how AFIG supports opportunities for fleet transition?
Sure. So the Alternative Fuel Incentive Grant Program has a couple of different project types. Some of the primary ones there is that it can help fund the incremental cost of an alternative fuel vehicle. So, for example, if an electric school bus, costs so much more than a typical gasoline school bus, then the owner of a fleet could apply for a grant for that cost differential. I believe up to about $100,000 is the cap on that at the moment. So that can go a long way in making that transition possible. While especially for those larger vehicles, this is still a decent price differential. And then it can also help with the cost of any refueling infrastructure for those fleets. So it could also help with up to 50% of the cost to install whatever charging infrastructure you might need for those electric vehicles.
Okay, next question. I think we've got this and maybe another one. Are there any plans to electrify the Turnpike?
Thanks, Deb. I can answer that question. So the Pennsylvania Turnpike is a different entity than the Department of Transportation, but I can talk about that a little bit. I know that the Turnpike has been working to have some electrification options within their right-of-way. Their right-of-way does fall under different rules than many of the interstates here in Pennsylvania because it's a different road entity. They do have some charging publicly available now, and I know that they have plans to continue adding electrification options along their corridor.
Thank you. Question about the availability of electric cars. It's hard to find electric cars in Western Pennsylvania. Also, what are the concerns about batteries in accidents?
Sure. So two separate things here, one at a time. So for electric vehicle availability, that's certainly not an issue that's unique to any one location. There are a variety of models. Well, many electric vehicle models are, there's just not enough of them made for the demand that's out there. That's certainly changing over time. It takes manufacturers, several years to really retool their plants and to change their production to be able to adjust to the rapidly changing demand. It is something that Pennsylvania is looking at options for how we can incentivize or require manufacturers to be selling more electric vehicles in Pennsylvania. But over time, it's really just something that, at least from a nationwide perspective, the manufacturers are going to have to adjust and scale up that electric vehicle production. And then the second part, can you remind me the second part, Deb?
Yep. And are there any concerns about batteries in electric vehicles and accidents?
Sure. So in terms of like accidents and on-road usage, electric vehicles have a much lower rate of fire or anything like that as compared to a gasoline equivalent. Additionally, gasoline vehicles can actually explode sometimes. An electric vehicle battery can potentially catch fire if it's really badly damaged in an accident, but it's going to be, just a warm, concentrated fire. That does take some effort for emergency responders to put out, but it's still an overall much lower safety concern than a gasoline vehicle.
Okay, next question is about insurance. Does the cost of insurance ever come up as a prohibitive factor in consumers choosing electric vehicles or not?
So my understanding is that the cost of car insurance for an electric vehicle may be higher than a gasoline vehicle only because the electric vehicle might have a higher cost or value. I'm not aware of any car insurance companies that charge more simply because the fuel type is different. I believe they're generally going off of the value of the vehicle should they be required to pay out for its damage. And many electric vehicles have a number of safety features on them, which could counter that and actually lower the car insurance cost. So I'm not personally aware of any other way that it could be an impact.
Okay, couple more questions here. This next one is also about batteries. Do the batteries act like electronics where if they're charged from the halfway charged point, it decreases the length of charge?
So that was more commonly the case back when like nickel hydride and some other types of battery were the predominant form of batteries. We really don't see that as much in lithium ion batteries. This is the case for your cell phone batteries nowadays as well, as they have transitioned to lithium ion. You generally don't see any loss in longevity from like not using the full amount of the battery or leaving it plugged in at full charge. Things like that have really are not really concerns anymore with the current battery technology.
Okay, a lot of good questions here. Next
Yes,
one
they are.
is the next one is about large gas station chains. Are the large gasoline retailers such as Sheetz and Wawa making plans to install charging stations?
They most certainly are. I've had a number of conversations with some of those larger retailers. We also see applications from them for our grant programs, whether it's them directly or them working with the charging equipment company to install that charging equipment. But definitely, in fact, some of the largest oil companies in the world are either purchasing or creating subdivisions within their corporations that are doing charging stations. So they're definitely looking and very interested in pursuing charging.
Okay, great. The next question is about the grid. How will the electric grids, I guess this is a nationally focused question, how will the electric grids, especially states like California, keep up with the increase in demand in the near future?
Sure. So impact to electric grid is an interesting one. It's definitely one that can be actually really good, or it can be a problem to address depending on how it's done. So our electric grid is designed to handle, peak demand, which usually occurs in the afternoon during the summer when air conditioning is at its peak. But we actually have, a lot of capacity overnight. So if we have electricity rates that incentivize charging that electric vehicle overnight, then we actually make our electric grid more efficient, and our electric utilities are actually able to charge us less per kilowatt hour for all of our electricity. So we can actually provide benefit to everyone. And there's then also less variation in their overnight and their peak demand usage. So they don't have to have as much peaker service, things like that. Obviously, if we don't have those things in place and we allow everyone to charge in the afternoon when they get home over the summer, then that could be a problem. But this is one of those things that a lot of utilities and government entities are looking to address, and it's why we're looking to do a study on it over the next year or so that we can help prepare our Public Utility Commission and our electric utilities for the proper way to handle increased electric vehicles over time.
Okay, great. And I just want to read a quick comment that someone submitted in follow-up to the question about EV batteries in accidents. And this attendee notes there's extensive training available for first responders and tow operators to ensure the safe handling of EVs in accidents. The National Fire Protection Association offers this training, and the Clean Cities coordinators can help get that training deployed to interested entities. Okay, so here's a question about requesting installation of charging stations. Is there anything the public can do in terms of requesting charging stations be installed in their locality or county? Are there stakeholder meetings that consider where the demand and interest are for charging stations?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure on the context behind that, but it's going to really vary. There are some places that have active groups, whether that's at the county or the municipal level, that are looking at this, that would definitely be interested in that. Even outside of that situation, you could certainly let your municipality, your county, your other elected officials know that you're interested. Obviously, everyone that's saying that they want this and that it would really make a difference goes a long way. But it's really going to vary at the statewide level. We have our Drive Electric Pennsylvania Coalition. Those are quarterly meetings that kind of help keep everyone stay up to date on the latest that's happening with electric vehicles in Pennsylvania. That is open to anyone to join that. So even if you're just an individual, you can sign up for that email list. You get some information. But that's really at a statewide level. So if you're looking for charging where you're at, that's just going to vary based on what's going on in your area.
Okay, we've got about a minute and a half, and I think we're down to 2 last questions. This one, I'm not sure if we don't have an answer for this here, we can follow up by email, I would think. What are templates to enter data to forecast replacing my fleet vehicles? Do these templates include maintenance costs for each type of vehicle to replace? Can you provide links to templates like these?
I know that there is a very extensive fleet calculator for considering a transition to electric vehicles of really like any size class. Not remembering who it's from at the moment. So if you would share your contact information, we can follow up and send you that information. But I know it is available.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Okay, and this is our last question for the day. I have installed 5 charging stations at 2 of my stores. Is there a grant that would cover some of the cost?
So after the fact, all that you would be able to look to is that federal incentive up to $30,000 for installing charging equipment. off of your tax liability in the following the next time you file your taxes. Before you would go to install charging stations, whether it's level 2 or DC fast, we have some opportunities there that you could apply to and try to get some funding. So certainly feel free to reach out to us or check that Driving PA Forward webpage for information about those types of programs.
Okay, great. This was a great discussion. I want to thank Colton and Natasha and Secretaries Gramian and McDonald. As I mentioned earlier, a video of today's talk will be available at dep.pa.gov/amped and on the DEP Facebook page. Thank you to our speakers and to everyone who attended today. This concludes our event.
Thank you, everyone.